The entire scientific world is a hierarchy of snobbery, with the physicists being the worst snobs, and really not thinking any other science exists. And as you go down the line from, or up, whichever way you want to say it, from physics to the newer and newer sciences, each one looks down on the newer one. And it's also important to realize that the newer sciences are far more difficult and far more complicated than the old ones.
Margaret Mead was born in 1901. She was raised in Pennsylvania and graduated from Barnard College. She received a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. She is author of 24 books, co-author or editor of 18 others. She is curator emeritus of ethnology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, professor of anthropology at Columbia, president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and on the board of numerous international organizations.
It's a little hard, you know, to judge what impact that you've had on a field. Initially, I think the most important thing I did was to introduce anthropology to the general literate public. That was why I was brought here to the American Museum of Natural History. The public already knew about archaeology, and they were interested in it, and they were willing to back it up. They didn't understand at all what the anthropologist did, or why he went to study those strange people on the other side of the world. And so one of my first commissions when I came here was that I should try to make anthropology more intelligible to the rest of the world. And then when I wrote my first book, Coming of Age in Samoa, it was about adolescence. And I thought that the people who were interested in adolescence were primarily teachers, and then to some extent physicians also. And they didn't speak Samoan, and they didn't speak technical anthropological language, and so I wrote it in English. And I wrote in English so that any literate person could read what I wrote. And I think this was important. And of course, this meant also young students, so that my books have very often been the first anthropology books that a student read, and very often they have been ways of leading them into anthropology. So that I think this is an important contribution. I'm not sure that what I've done in studying the generation gap is directly a byproduct of the culture and personality approach, because I think it's perhaps even wider than that. In describing our present situation, I identified as about the middle of the 1960s something new that had happened in the world, which we called the generation gap. It wasn't very well named, but that's what we called it, because all the young people who had grown up since World War II were different in their experience than all the people who had grown up before World War II. And not only this, but this was true in every country in the world. We've often had societies in which there was a terrific gap between parents and children. This is true after a revolution. It's sometimes true after a war. It's always true when parents emigrate from one country to another and the children grow up in a different society. But this was the first time in human history when all the people of the world were affected by the same situation because of the communications we have around the world. So that for young people growing up after World War II, there was no one in the whole world who represented their future to them. Now, I use the words post-figurative, co-figurative, and pre-figurative to describe the three phases in history. Post-figurative to describe those societies where you died in the bed you were born in, and where, looking at your grandfather, you knew what kind of a grandfather you would be, or if you were a girl, what kind of grandmother you would be. So that the end of life was visible for children at the very beginning, and they moved towards a known conclusion. I use the word co-figurative for all those societies that are changing rapidly, where people are moving around, so that the children of immigrants, for instance, learn from their peers. If they go to a secondary school, they learn from the other children in a secondary school. And you tend to have what we call a peer culture, where young people learn from each other instead of learning from the adults. But in such a society, there are always some adults, always have been, some adults that represented the future. So, for instance, if we had young Japanese in the United States as the first generation, or young Italians coming to this country, the children would go to school and learn from their age mates, but then they had the people who'd been here before as their models. And this I called co-figurative. The new thing in the world, and the thing that has only been true at very special moments in history, and never true as it is now, is what I've called prefigurative. That is that now the children have to lead a life and move towards a conclusion that is unknown. And if the adults are going to understand the world in which they live, they have to look at the children whose experience is different from their own. It doesn't mean that children know more than adults. It simply means that children know more about living in the present-day world than adults, and so are able to ask questions that wouldn't occur to the adults, because the adults grew up in such a different world. This is a place where I've worked. I've 50 years of active files here, and things that are where I put them 50 years ago and 45 years ago and 35 years ago, and I can go and find them in a minute. And this office has been my most permanent home since 1926, when I came back from Samoa and was given this room. This had never been an office. This was part of the apartment that belonged to the superintendent of the buildings in those days. And he used to stand in the doorway and shake his head at me and say, "Oh, my children were born in this room." And I was promised that as soon as there was a proper office downstairs, I would have it. But there was none that was free. But I discovered very quickly that this was a very good place to stay. There are 2 stairways. If you don't want to see somebody who's coming up one, you can go down the other. Nobody comes up unless they really want to see you. They don't wander in and out saying, "Did you see this in the morning paper?" I started thinking about what I might do when I was, I suppose, about 10 or 11. One point I wanted to be a nun. Another point I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a minister's wife and run a small country parish. At the same time, I had 6 children. By the time when I got to college for a while, I wanted to write pageants, community pageants. I thought that would be a movable feast that I could take wherever I went, and would be an interesting thing to do. I was quite clear that I had to choose between being a scientist, which to me as a child of social scientists meant being a social scientist, or a politician, or a writer. I had the good luck to room with a really great poet, and it was quite clear I wasn't a great poet. There isn't any place in literature in this country, there wasn't then and there isn't now, for people who perform smaller than acts than great stars. We give the stars a chance, and we try to turn everybody into stars. Science, on the other hand, is a place for everyone, and you can use the best skills you have. If they're not very great, there's still a place for you. I considered politics because I was a good public speaker and I was an intercollegiate debater. But I decided that if politics were too short-term, that I was more interested in things that would have a longer-term effect on society. And so I decided to go into social science. Now, that wasn't anthropology at that point. At that point, I was still considering psychology, and it wasn't until later that I decided that anthropology was the most pressing thing to do. And from then on, there wasn't any doubt. Well, when one considers how much in one's own life is good luck or good management, which people have been arguing about me almost all my life, I mean, since I was a graduate student, because I have been extraordinarily lucky. And there are lots of things that happen that I have to put down to luck, because, for instance, on my first field trip, I might have gone to any Polynesian island. I went to Samoa because my professor said that I had to go somewhere where there was a boat every 3 weeks. So Samoa had a boat every 3 weeks, so that's where I went. But Samoa was the perfect island for the problem that I was going to study. Adolescent girls were under less pressure in Samoa than almost any place else in the known world. And I could have gone to other islands where adolescents would have looked much like our own. I could have done just as good work, but it wouldn't have interested anybody. It would just have reconfirmed their prejudices. And this has happened over and over again, that through a series of what looked like perfectly fortuitous circumstances, I've ended up in a spot that was ideal. Now, of course, one has to also add that the anthropologist is prepared to make something out of what he finds. We don't go out with a set of fixed hypotheses. We go out in an open-minded way, and if I hadn't found X, I probably would have found Y, and that might have looked just as felicitous. Periodically, some societies get interested in the relationships between men and women that have been disturbed by change. Sometimes it's by revolutionary change, sometimes it's technical change, sometimes it's a change in the ratio between the sexes. If too many men immigrate, for instance, and leave the women at home. But whenever there's change, there's likely to be a change in the relationship between the sexes. And ever since the Industrial Revolution, we have been throwing women out of the protection that they've had traditionally. From husbands, fathers, brothers, sons, someone took some kind of responsibility for them. And then came the Industrial Revolution, and we put women down the mines in England, into the cotton mills, and they could then earn something, not very much, but enough so that their male relatives could wash their hands of them, and their husbands could desert them without the onus that fell on them before. And at the same time, of course, when the women were put out of the home, they began agitating for the kind of education and the kind of opportunities that men had who lived a public life outside the home. Now, it comes in waves. We had a big burst of women's suffrage before World War I, and in the United States, we got women's suffrage right after World War I. And then things were relatively dormant for quite a long time. And the present feminist outburst around the world, which is being carried around the world by radio and TV everywhere, is a response to several things. It's a response to the population explosion, and we're no longer asking women to have as many children as possible, which means there are going to be many years after their children are grown when society is going to expect them to make some other kind of contribution, because they won't be having one child after another that dies and dies and dies. It's a response, therefore, to the increased recognition that we need women in public life. We're beginning to realize that if women do not play a part in public life, the parts of life for which they were responsible are neglected. That it's nonsense to try to have a national policy on population unless women play an intimate part in formulating that policy. That if we let food be planned for and regulated entirely by men who've been concerned with production, we ignore nutrition and distribution. Also, in the United States particularly, but in some other parts of the modern world also, we're getting a reaction against the 1950s when there was such an emphasis on everybody having a large number of children. And educated women were put out in the suburbs and set to looking after children with no other way of using their education at all, and they've rebelled against it. So the local features of women's liberation in the United States, in Scandinavia, to a lesser extent in the rest of Europe, are related to post-war conditions of housing and community development, the difficulty for women of combining housekeeping and any kind of a career. And these are local irritants in the general situation. My mother was a sociologist who made the first study of Italian immigrants in this country. So that when I was a small child, we lived in a town where we'd moved so Mother could study the Italians. My grandmother, my father's mother, who lived with us, had been a school teacher, but with very little education, which was true in those days. And then when my grandfather came home from the Civil War, he took his bonus and they both went to college together and graduated together. So that the two women who were closest to me, my mother and my grandmother, had obviously married, had children, and had professional careers. So that it never occurred to me that women shouldn't have brains. It never occurred to me that you didn't use them, or that you didn't make some selection of a career that you wanted that was more than just being married and having children. When I was a senior in college, there were courses that undergraduates talked about, you know, and you heard about the professors at Columbia, who were the big professors that everybody wanted to take. And from the things I heard, Franz Boas sounded most interesting. I didn't know anything really about anthropology, and I had read his Mind a Primitive Man when I was a sophomore and gotten a C for what I wrote about it. I hadn't been able to get any sense of freshness out of it at all because I'd grown up in a family where sociological ideas of this sort were a commonplace. And this is one of the problems, of course, with social science children. It's very hard to arrest their attention when they get to college because they heard it all before. But what I heard about Boas himself sounded exciting, and so I took his course and found him, you know, someone who was absolutely the ground under one's feet. The sort of thing I remember, for instance, he was giving us a lecture about language, and he was one of the great linguists of his period. He started the study of pre-literate languages, virtually. And he said once in a lecture, they say that in Chinese, and he went on to make a generalization, I do not know Chinese. And he was so absolutely clear about what he knew, what he didn't know, what needed to be known, how things could be approached, and he had this tremendous sense of a landscape which we all had to probe, and that you had a sense that each time he made a study, he went just as far in as he could go. That wouldn't have to be done again. Ruth Benedict was a teaching assistant when I was a senior at Barnard. She was 15 years older than I was, but she had spent many years expecting to have children and trying to fill her time up until she had children. So she'd studied rhythmic dancing and she'd done social work, and she'd tried a whole series of things, and hadn't found anything that was at all satisfactory. She wasn't a feminist. She wasn't interested in many of the things that people were talking about during that period. Then she found anthropology, and this gave her what she felt she needed. I had already started virtually a master's essay in psychology. And I remember having lunch with Ruth, and she said, well, Professor Boas and I have nothing to offer except the most important work that needs to be done. Now, through the years, I became more and more a colleague after having been a student, because although there was this wide gap in time between us, she had used that time differently and not as a professional anthropologist. So by the time that she published her first book, Patterns of Culture, I published my third book at the same time and dealing with some of the same problems, and we were working back and forth. Then when the war came, it took us quite a long time to get her interested in the sort of thing that the rest of us were developing, in the study of national character. But in the end, we got her interested, and she came to Washington and did studies at a distance of Burma and Thailand and the Netherlands, and finally of Japan, and wrote at the end of the war her book, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which was a magnificent contribution to an understanding of Japan and to the methodology of anthropology and looking at countries that it was impossible to visit because they were made inaccessible by World War II conditions. At the end of the war, she and I started a research project where we had many disciplines and many countries working together. And when she died, I took over the directorship of that project. When we use World War II as a kind of watershed in the world, of course, it isn't just the war. It is because the bomb was invented, and along with the bomb, we had a whole series of other things starting. The world became one, not one in any political form, but one in interdependence. That can only happen once. It never happened before, and it has now happened, and we presume it will continue. The bomb meant that for the first time, human beings had the power to destroy all life on this earth. They'd had the power to kill very many people, some millions of people in World War I. But this was the first time that they had the power to kill everyone, to destroy every living thing. And the difference between total destruction and partial destruction is enormous, so that there is a complete watershed between the world before the discovery of the bomb and the world afterwards. In the summer of 1945, I had a book about half finished about the post-war world. And when the first bomb went off, I tore it right straight across and threw the whole manuscript in a waste paper basket, because there wasn't a sentence that would be right that had been written before that event.
Margaret Mead has returned several times to the islands in which she did her early work. On each visit, she has studied closely the impact of rapid social and cultural change.
Talk to you a little bit about what you will be doing as you grow older. Now, Papua New Guinea is becoming a country, isn't it? It's becoming a nation, which means you want to be able to talk to all the people that you meet. Now, when you go away to school and meet school children from all over the territory, from Tolai school children, and school children from Moresby, and school children from the Trobriands, and from New Ireland, and from Buka, what language will you speak to them? English, won't you? I began my field work almost 50 years ago, and I worked with children. Most people, most anthropologists work with old people. Sometimes with very old people, because they're likely to come in just on the edge of change, just as the buffalo are disappearing, or just as people are stopping plowing with oxen, or weaving their sails out of mats, and they want to find the old people that can tell them what it was like. But I was interested in children, and I worked with children, and that means that when I go back to a society now, there's still a lot of people alive, and often in very prominent positions, that I knew 50, 40, 30 years ago. When I first knew them, the Manus people in the Admiralty Islands, in what is now Papua New Guinea, were virtually in the Stone Age. They had a few wire hooks, a few pieces of cloth, a few pieces of iron. They were living in a protectorate situation under the League of Nations, a trust territory. But they were just out of the Stone Age, just out of the kind of warfare that belonged to the Stone Age. So I had the opportunity in 1953 to go back to a society that I'd studied in 1928, and the small boys that had run my house in 1928 were now the leaders of the village. And I had an opportunity to see perhaps what's one of the most rapid pieces of social change that had ever occurred in the whole of history. In the course of that 25 years, they skipped thousands of years and moved under their own steam and under some discouragement from their colonial administrators into the modern world.
Well, 1946, I suppose only killing you plays you all right.
Because only killing me all right too.
Yes.
Killing me and I knew what money come up and I can look in it all right. And I must pay him passing us and power.
Long time long body streets and you belay no pride.
You belay no pride. Long die.
Yes. We savvy. That's all you know die. You make him place he get up.
Yes.
Suppose you die altogether. Suppose too much man he get up along this fellow, time along Pally, how he got up in you fella. Too much man he got up, now cross, now fight through. Only come killing you. Suppose there come a little musket, now killing you. John, now Raphael, now Petrus, now Locust.
And I was able to see what they had done and how they had done it. And I was able to say that the conditions of change of this sort were that everybody must move at once. You don't say to the old people, you stay there, you don't amount to anything, you'll die someday. They brought them along. They looked at their whole society and they moved right across the board to change everything. At least look at everything and decide whether to change it or not and whether it made sense. And they had an exceedingly gifted leader. And these seemed to be the conditions that made it possible for the people of Perry to move in this extraordinary fashion.
Afternoon, Teresa.
Very few people have moved this fast, and very few people probably ever will. But the fact that one group of people could do it is earnest that it can be done, and that rapid change, when it's done under people's own power, with their full commitment to it, can be less traumatic and less difficult than slower change. Well, of course, anthropology has changed enormously in my lifetime. We've learned to look at things that we never looked at before. Of course, people didn't look at babies. They simply noticed if a baby was named or circumcised or had an ox killed to celebrate its birth, but they never looked at the baby. And now we look at mother and child behavior in great detail. We're not only able to film it, but we have the kind of analyzers that we can look at it frame by frame and see things that are too fast to be caught in the field. The kind of tape recordings we can make today are a very long way from the kind of records that could be made 25 or 30 years ago. Video has given us another control, because although video isn't very fine-grained, but you can set it up and see what people do over a long stretch of time, and it's cheap, and you can play it right back, which is sometimes an advantage and sometimes it isn't, and you have to be rather careful about that. And I'm hoping that before the last primitive people change their way of life so that it won't be so interesting to other people anymore, that maybe there will be a 360-degree camera that we can set up in the middle of a community, and then later students can be placed in the middle of this. You know, they project it in some kind of a globe so that you feel as if you were right in the middle of the scene, and they can learn what it's like to find out what's happening behind your back while something else is happening in front of your face. And then there's been of course, another great change in anthropological work. When I entered anthropology, our major task was to rescue vanishing cultures. We knew that the people who lived in remote islands and up in the Arctic and in the jungle were our contemporaries. They've been here just as long as we have, and they're members of the same human species. But they've been cut off from the historical streams of inventions that fed us. So there was no wheel in the Americas, except one little child's toy, but otherwise no wheel. No arch in the Americas, the kind of arch that goes like this. Only what we call a corbelled arch, where you overlap stones so they get closer and closer together in a peak. And the people who had been cut off from iron, cut off from script, cut off from the places where great ships met, had continued to live and change, but change much more slowly, as other peoples had lived 10,000 and 20,000 years ago. And it was very important to record this before it disappeared. If we let one language disappear, we're poor, and we can never invent it again. It's taken a given group of people hundreds and hundreds of years to invent each human language, invent it by continuous use in human relationships between parents and children, a language that you recognize when a baby talks it, or when a drunk talks it, or when a madman talks it, but it's still a language that's being developed for them to talk to each other together. This was our main task when I went into anthropology. This was presented to me as the thing that must be done because these precious cultures were disappearing all over the world as they were brought in contact with traders and missionaries. But when I went into the field, for the first time, I went into the field with a problem. We wanted to see whether adolescence was as painful in all societies as it was in Europe and the United States in 1925. And so the idea of using the field, that is, villages among primitive peoples or in peasant peoples in other parts of the world, as laboratories grew up. And these weren't laboratories where we experimented on people. History made the experiments, and we could go in and judge the results. Museums are ways in which people can find out about the rest of the world, sometimes about their own past, sometimes about other people's past, sometimes about just other parts of the world. And in this museum we have many things that have been saved that people no longer valued themselves, very often that they would have destroyed as they became so modern or became converted to a world religion or something of the sort, would have thrown away. And they're safe here, and we keep them and look after them very carefully so that those things will be here when their grandchildren want to come and see them. And it's important now that we have museums in every part of the world, and that those museums not only emphasize their own treasures, as sometimes they're rather prone to do today, but also try to build up treasures, build up descriptive material about other parts of the world. So the children in Nigeria know something about the peoples of the Americas and the peoples of Asia, and children in Japan know something about Africa and Europe. And museums are a place where you come under your own steam. Things are put there and people come and see them. A film goes before your eyes very fast and you have to follow it, and when it isn't shown anymore, it isn't there. But an exhibit in the museum stays there, and you can come back again and again, and for some things in this museum, you can bring your children because they stay there long enough. So it has a kind of permanent record and a degree of freedom for people who come to it. It can be very valuable, and especially valuable for children who are trying to learn and learn at their own pace what the rest of the world is like. One of the ironies of the contemporary world is that in many of the emerging nations, anthropologists are being rejected. And it was anthropologists who did all the work that demonstrated that your level of technology had nothing to do with your level of potential competence. It was anthropologists who went in and studied the most primitive people, and demonstrated that they thought like other people, but they might not be able to count to a large number because they never needed it in the world that they lived in. But just because anthropologists have been close to the most primitive people in any country, today, when those countries are going through all sorts of upheavals in trying to establish their national identity, it's anthropologists they often turn on. They don't want to hear about the way they lived 50 years ago. And because the anthropologists know and recorded them, they turn on them and they accuse them of having exploited them. And yet, unless we have a continuing anthropological assay of what's happening in the world, we'll lose our sense of proportion. Our sense of proportion depends on knowing what other people do, on not believing that whatever we do was totally God-ordained or totally natural or the only way that things can be done. So it's very unfortunate that in many parts of the world today, anthropologists are not welcomed, that people have turned on those who were their closest friends because they wish to build up myths about their past, or in some instances because they feel so strongly about some political issue that there's no place for people who care about the whole society and don't want to take sides for one part against another. I would like to see the separate disciplines that we now have in what are called the social sciences or the human sciences are organized quite differently. In the natural sciences, the sciences are organized in terms of separate units, whether they're dealing with an atom or a molecule or a cell. But in the social sciences, the disciplines of psychology, sociology, anthropology, economics, political science are more or less parallel to each other, each of them looking at the same phenomena and really at the same level of analysis with a few different bits of jargon. And this means they don't develop very fast. Each group looks at it from a slightly different point of view. And what we have today are a large number of schools, a tremendous amount of jargon, and a tremendous amount of waste effort. I'd like to see us have a human science in which everyone who worked in the human sciences would have some competency, all the way from human biology to an understanding of the great works that human beings have produced, their architecture, their literature, their art, which now get called the humanities and put somewhere else. The entire scientific world is a hierarchy of snobbery, with the physicists being the worst snobs and really not thinking any other science exists. And as you go down the line from, or up, whichever way you want to say it, from physics to the newer and newer sciences, each one looks down on the newer one. And it's also important to realize that the newer sciences are far more difficult and far more complicated than the old ones. And therefore, of course, they don't appear to get as far as fast. Now, there's a basic division, and it runs right through the sciences, even invading physics, in people like Schrödinger's, who wrote a book called Temperament and Physics, between the people who are interested in pattern and the people who are interested in counting things and who are interested in reducing any phenomena to the kind of unit that you can count. And this is basic. It's probably due to different casts of mind, so that in any science at any given time you have the people that are interested in qualitative studies and in pattern, and the people that are interested in statistics, what they call stochastic models, and working with theories of probability, which are quite different. We've had one move after another towards interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary work. The trouble is that in American universities, we're organized by departments, and these represent vested interests, professorships, scholarships, buildings, all sorts of deep investments. And we've tried a lot of inventions to break this down. We've built institutes where 3 or 4 or 5 disciplines were supposed to work together. We've had cross-departmental committees. Sometimes in some of the new universities in Africa and India, where it's a totally new university, there's a possibility of crossing lines much faster than they're crossed here. And sometimes the new universities in the new countries are more rigid in copying old models even than we are ourselves. We haven't yet found a formula which will make it possible to transcend these rigid lines, just as we haven't been able to do this in the way we divide human welfare up in the world, and the way we talk, for instance, about health and welfare. And during World War II in England, it was impossible for Anna Freud, who was doing a magnificent job with children, to get any money, because she wouldn't say that her work was either 51% health or 51% education. And this sort of chopping up human beings exists in universities, and it exists in ministries everywhere in the world. It exists in the United Nations. So we have a conference on the environment, but it doesn't include the oceans, because the oceans belong to somebody else. And it doesn't include population, because that's a separate division. So that we have a continual task of trying to bring things together that have been separated in ways they shouldn't be separated. There are people who act as if the family was dead or finished simply because we're going through a transition, a very rapid transition, in which the family, of course, expresses all the disturbances that are going on. Since World War II, in almost every part of the world, we've been moving towards a nuclear family. And the nuclear family, just a father and mother and little children, is a very vulnerable family. It's the easiest family for industry to deal with. It's the easiest family to emigrate from the country to the city. It's the easiest family to immigrate around the world, and the most helpless. And it isn't the kind of family that's very viable. A viable family is a family that's embedded with relatives, friends, neighbors. And so we hear a great deal at present about the difficulties in marriage, because people are living under new conditions. The husband and wife very often were reared under new conditions, and they have too little support from the community around them. Now, as for romantic love comes in and out. It's rare. Certain societies at certain times make something of it. Usually societies with a large amount of leisure. In a court, for instance, you had time to talk about romantic love. There's a good deal more romantic love in the United States today than there was in the 1950s. Because in the 1950s, everybody was so busy getting married to somebody that they didn't have any time for romantic love. Today, there's more emphasis on individual choice. You don't have to get married if you don't want to, so you can at least pick out the person that you love instead of picking out the person who's willing to marry you. In 1948, when the first big Congress on mental health was held, the whole of the, quotes, Western world was worrying because the family was too small and was in danger. And the people who came from the Mediterranean and from the East were worrying because the family was too strong. And this is the sort of thing that we're likely to have, that because change isn't even in the world, we may hit something in the United States that will be hit in other countries 20 years later, 40 years later. Of course, in most of the rest of the traditional world, in most of Africa, in most of Asia, in most of South America, people lived in communities, and they lived in, sometimes in extended families, sometimes simply with members of the family close by, and they were dependent on a large number of known people. But whenever they move into the cities, whether they're moving into Calcutta or Bangkok or wherever they're moving, we get a trend towards the nuclear family. Yeah, a young man will take his wife and children and move alone into the city to get away from his friends and relatives that want him to continue life in a traditional way. So that one of the things that's happening is that in the villages and in the more traditional areas, you have old people left there, and women left there if men go away to work, but a great proportion of the young people tend to move away and set up nuclear families in the cities. It's impossible, of course, to tell what direction we're going. We may go into a direction in which we keep everybody in boxes, as we're doing now. Boxes in high-rises, boxes spread out over the surface of good agricultural ground, using it up. Or we may build better concentrated, more diversified communities, in which the family unit will be what the family unit is now. Parents and children, but not parents and children isolated from everybody else in the world, but parents and children who live near other people, where the children can share relationships with large numbers of other people. Well, I found that when I had a child of my own, I became a much poorer observer of children than I had been before. When you have a child of your own, you compare other children with them. All other children are older or younger or fatter or thinner or brighter or something than your own child. And so from a observer of children that could look at the whole range of children, I felt that my vision was distorted for a while. I learned a lot about mothers that I hadn't known before from being a mother. But I think I, in a sense, learned less about children than I learned when there isn't a child that I'm too highly concerned with. And we had an amusing event. I had films made of my daughter from birth right straight on. So when she had a daughter, I sent up the films for her to look at. And she could compare herself at 3 months with her child, my granddaughter at 6 months. And she looked at them and said, I think my baby's much nicer than your baby. That's what I mean about motherhood on the whole not being a road to objective and even perceptive observation. Now, I've just finished a book on the world, which I'm dedicating to my granddaughter and to my great-goddaughter, and, of course, dedicating it in terms of what I'm thinking about the future for them. The first wish is that they be here. We've just begun to really think about future generations. Of course, people thought about their own grandchildren. They planted trees for their grandchildren, or they built houses that they expected to bequeath to them. And they went out and bled and died to protect their countries for their grandchildren. But the general assumption has usually been that grandchildren would live pretty much as we did, whoever we were. In places where change is very rapid, they know this isn't so. So that in New Guinea, for instance, people will say, you and I grew up very differently, but our children, once they're educated, will walk the same road. And they look forward to a period when all over the world, people are able to participate in a worldwide sharing of responsibility. But it's only since World War II that people have begun to realize that their children will not live in the same world that they do, and that we have to take responsibility for saving this planet that we're eroding and contaminating and wrecking for the children of the future, and that if we don't, the children will live, if they live at all, if we don't have a nuclear holocaust from nuclear weapons or too much fission generation around the world, that we're going to have to make a tremendous effort now to make a habitable world for our children. That before we engage in great technological decisions that may wreck a whole state, that may divert a river from one state to another, that may turn a whole part of the country into a desert with strip mining, that may set up nuclear plants that endanger a whole population, we ought to have some way of taking thought. And out of that suggestion has come what I regard as a new institution, and that's the environmental impact statement. We have it in the United States. I believe that it's coming in many other countries, and we're hoping in not so far a future to have an international impact statement so that we could discuss what one country plans for its fishery or its oil wells off the coast are doing to the ocean that is shared by the whole world. But what the impact statement is at present is a requirement that before a government does something that will make a tremendous impact on the environment, they prepare a statement of what the expected results are and alternatives to the course of action they're proposing. And then other agencies and interested organizations can testify also before the dam is built, or the road put through, or the oil wells drilled, or the strip mining started. This is a new invention where we take thought before we do something instead of lamenting after we've done it. Now, today there is a science of futurology. It was about 15 years ago that I proposed that universities ought to have chairs of the future. But there was no reason why you shouldn't have a professor who was responsible for the future, just as we had a professor who was responsible for the 10th century or for our knowledge of ancient Egypt or ancient India or classical China. Why shouldn't we have people whose responsibility it was to know about the probabilities of the future? What was happening to population? What was happening to our arable land? What was happening to the technological inventions that were going to change the future? Today, many, many universities have programs in the future. And there are large numbers of people who are spending their time trying to think about the future, trying to make predictions. The most striking ones, of course, are the two reports that have been made to the Club of Rome, Limits of Growth and Mankind at a Turning Point, where for the first time specialists have looked at the whole world, tried to estimate how many people there will be, how much grain there will be, what the weather will be like, how much pollution is occurring in all our streams and oceans, and try to put this all together and begin to think about what each country and each region has to do if we're going to conserve our resources for the future. Well, the present enormous use of material things, the present affluence, is very, very new. Most people of my age grew up in a world in which you put out the lights and you untied the string around a package very carefully and wrapped it up and put it in the teapot to use again. This excessive waste, this excessive use of material things, excessive use of power that has come in since World War II is new. And many people think that we have to make a tremendous change in attitudes, but it didn't take us very long to make the change from scarcity to affluence. It didn't take very long in World War II to correct some of our affluence and go back to more frugal habits again. Every country in the world is faced in some form with a population explosion. It has different implications. In technologically undeveloped countries, people are faced with children that they cannot educate and cannot feed and cannot care for. In the technologically highly developed countries, each child uses a tremendous amount of the scarce resources in the world and takes part in a tremendous amount of pollution. So everywhere in the world, population is growing too fast, and we need to introduce controls. But we know now, especially after the United Nations Conference on Population in Bucharest, that we can never expect to control population when people are too poor and their health and education conditions are too great, because their only possible safeguard is their children, and they will continue to have them until conditions improve. It's very common for people to say that there is no American culture. It's said by two groups of people. It's said by people who have cultures that are much older, especially Europe, whose cultures aren't so very old after all when they're compared with Asia. And it's said by many Americans who feel that they belong to some part of the country or to some ethnic group or to some racial group which distinguishes them so much from other Americans that they're not really Americans. And we are a very young country. We're just celebrating our bicentennial as a country, although we are now one of the oldest governments on earth, which is an odd paradox to think about also. And perhaps it's because America is such a young country that we've been so much interested in anthropology. Sometimes people from Europe have said that we substitute space for time. And because we can't go back to a tremendous past to measure where we've come or who we are, we, instead of doing that, compare ourselves with other countries all the way around the world and are interested in a comparative science of human behavior. But Americans don't think of themselves as Americans as often as people in some other countries do, like Poland, for instance, or Scotland. We don't go to bed at night like Americans, and we don't eat like Americans or behave like Americans unless we're thinking of ourselves as over against another country, or when we're abroad or at war, or when we're thinking about our past. So that when we're celebrating our 200th birthday, this is a period of reevaluating ourselves, of looking back on what kind of country we were, looking back on the dreams on which this country was founded, and saying how far we've come, and are we closer to those dreams or further from them. We also think of ourselves as Americans when we think about the future, and think about the need of protecting this country for the future, preserving it for our children and our children's children, and defending the things that we value most against the hazards of the modern world, hazards that are no longer war, but are the danger of nuclear holocausts, of the destruction of the environment, of the erosion of the soil, of our inability as a people to govern ourselves and care for ourselves and rebuild our cities and build the new communities that have to be built. When we think in those terms, we also think of ourselves as Americans. When I think about what other people in the world might think about the work that I've done, I'd like them to know that I've always enjoyed being a woman, that I've always enjoyed doing the kind of things that women could do, and that I feel at home in a great many places in the world. And I'd like them to know that I wouldn't have wanted to live at any other time in history than the present time. I'm glad I'm alive now. I'm glad I've been alive long enough to see so many changes and to look forward to so many new changes.